The third time Dr. Hayes told me Max needed another expensive procedure. Something inside me finally snapped. I stared at my golden retriever's trusting brown eyes and realized I'd been a fool for 8 months. My name is Jennifer Walsh, and I'm 34 years old. I live in Cedar Falls, Iowa, where I work as a high school English teacher. Max has been my constant companion for 3 years now, ever since my divorce from Kevin. When people ask why I never remarried, I joke that Max is better company than most men. He doesn't leave dirty socks on the floor or forget anniversaries. The trouble started last winter when Max developed what Dr. Hayes called chronic digestive sensitivity. It began with a simple checkup at Hayes Animal Clinic, the newest vet office in town. Hayes was young, confident, with diplomas covering his office walls. He spoke in medical terms that made him sound incredibly knowledgeable. "Your dog has early signs of inflammatory bowel disease," he'd said, running his fingers along Max's belly. "We need to start treatment immediately before it progresses." I trusted him completely. Why wouldn't I? He was a veterinarian. The treatment started small. Special food that cost $60 a bag. Monthly blood work at $90 each visit. Then came the medications, the supplements, the necessary procedures. My credit card balance climbed steadily, but I didn't question it. This was Max's health we were talking about. My sister Claire thought I was being taken advantage of. She'd mentioned it during our weekly phone calls, suggesting I get a second opinion. But Dr. Hayes always had explanations for why Max's condition was so complex, so rare. "Some dogs are just more sensitive," he'd say with that practiced sympathy. "Max is lucky to have an owner who cares enough to pursue proper treatment." The breaking point came on a Tuesday afternoon in September. I'd brought Max in for what Dr. Hayes called an emergency consultation. Max had been perfectly fine that morning, playing fetch in the backyard, eating his breakfast normally. But according to Dr. Hayes, the blood work showed concerning irregularities. "I'm afraid we need to do exploratory surgery," he said, not meeting my eyes as he scribbled notes. "There's a possibility of internal blockage. Without immediate intervention, Max could face serious complications." The estimate was $3,800. I looked down at Max, who was wagging his tail and trying to lick my hand. He didn't look sick. He looked exactly like the healthy, happy dog who'd woken me up that morning by dropping his tennis ball on my chest. Something cold settled in my stomach. Not fear for Max, but something else. Suspicion. "Dr. Hayes," I said slowly, "could I see those blood work results?" He hesitated for just a moment too long. "Of course, but the technical details might be confusing for someone without medical training." That's when I knew. The condescending tone, the hesitation, the way he'd been pushing increasingly expensive procedures while Max showed no signs of actual illness. I'd been played. "I'd like to think about the surgery," I said, keeping my voice steady. "Can I take Max home for tonight?" "Dr. Hayes frowned. "Mrs. Walsh, I really don't recommend delaying treatment. Every hour counts with potential blockages." But I was already standing, clipping Max's leash to his collar. My hands weren't shaking anymore. They were steady with purpose. "I'll call you tomorrow with my decision." I walked out of that office knowing I would never bring Max back, but I also knew something else. If Dr. Hayes was doing this to me, he was doing it to other people, other pets who might not have owners willing to question a veterinarian's authority. That night, I sat at my kitchen table with my laptop open, researching everything I could find about veterinary fraud. Max lay at my feet, completely relaxed, occasionally lifting his head to check if I had any treats. He had no idea. He'd just been diagnosed with a life-threatening condition that required immediate surgery. The more I read, the angrier I became. Stories of fake diagnoses, unnecessary procedures, healthy animals put through traumatic treatments they didn't need. It was a perfect crime. Who questions a doctor trying to save your beloved pet? By midnight, I had a plan. Not just to protect Max, but to expose Dr. Hayes for what he really was. I started with a simple phone call to Riverside Veterinary Hospital across town. "I'd like to schedule a comprehensive health examination for my dog," I told the receptionist. "I need a complete second opinion on some recent diagnoses." The appointment was set for Thursday morning. 48 hours to document everything Dr. Hayes had told me, every treatment he'd recommended, every dollar he'd charged. I opened a new document on my computer and began typing. At the top, I wrote, Max Walsh, treatment history, Dr. Robert Hayes, DVM. But something nagged at me as I worked. How long had Dr. Hayes been practicing in Cedar Falls? I pulled up the clinic's website and checked the About Us section. According to the bio, Dr. Hayes had graduated from Iowa State's veterinary program in 2019 and immediately opened his practice here. Fresh out of school with enough money to open his own clinic in an expensive downtown location? That seemed unlikely for a new graduate. Most veterinarians I knew had started working for established practices before branching out on their own. I spent the next hour searching for information about Dr. Robert Hayes. What I found was confusing and troubling. There was a record of a Robert Hayes graduating from Iowa State's veterinary program in 2019. But when I dug deeper, following links to his graduation photos and early career information, I discovered something strange. The Robert Hayes who graduated had specialized in large animal medicine and had immediately taken a position at a ranch veterinary practice in Montana. The photos from his graduation ceremony showed a man who looked somewhat similar to the Dr. Hayes I'd been seeing, but with subtle differences in facial structure and build. My hands trembled as I stared at the computer screen. I pulled up more photos from the real Robert Hayes' social media profiles and professional listings. The man in Montana was definitely not the same person who had been treating Max for the past 8 months. I called the registrar's office at Iowa State the next morning, pretending to be verifying credentials for an insurance company. The woman on the phone was polite but firm. The Robert Hayes they had on record was definitely working in Montana and had never practiced in Iowa. "Are you sure he hasn't opened a second practice?" I pressed. "Ma'am, Dr. Hayes signed a 5-year contract with Big Sky Veterinary Services in Montana. He's their large animal specialist. I spoke with him just last month about a continuing education credit verification." I hung up and looked at Max, who was lying in a patch of morning sunlight by the window. His coat gleamed golden. His breathing was steady and relaxed. This was not a sick dog. This was exactly what the fake Dr. Hayes feared most, a healthy animal whose owner was asking questions. The appointment at Riverside Veterinary Hospital couldn't come fast enough. But first, I needed to tell someone what I'd discovered. I called Claire. "Jen, slow down," my sister said when I'd finished explaining everything in a breathless rush. "You're saying this guy stole another vet's identity. I'm saying the real Robert Hayes is in Montana, working with cattle and horses. Whoever's been treating Max has been using his credentials." Claire was quiet for a moment. "Have you considered that maybe you're overthinking this? I mean, there could be 2 Robert Hayes veterinarians. It's not that uncommon a name." The doubt in her voice stung. Claire had always been the skeptical one, the one who thought I read too much into things. When Kevin and I divorced, she'd suggested I was being dramatic about his gambling problem too. "Claire, I've spent over $4,000 on treatments Max didn't need." "But you don't know that yet," she said gently. "Look, I get that you're upset about the money, but accusing someone of identity theft is serious. What if you're wrong?" I ended the call feeling more alone than before. Claire was right about one thing. This was serious. Too serious to handle without being absolutely certain. I spent the rest of Wednesday researching everything I could find about veterinary licensing in Iowa, identity theft, and fraud. I printed out photos of the real Robert Hayes, copies of his graduation records, and his current employment information in Montana. I also made a detailed timeline of every appointment with the fake Dr. Hayes, every diagnosis, every treatment, every charge. Thursday morning arrived grey and drizzly. Max seemed excited about the car ride, pressing his nose against the window as we drove across town to Riverside. He had no idea this appointment would determine whether he was sick or healthy, whether the last 8 months had been necessary medical care or elaborate fraud. Dr. Sarah Chen was everything the fake Dr. Hayes wasn't. Mid-50s, calm, straightforward, she listened to my concerns without interrupting, examined Max thoroughly, and spoke in plain English instead of intimidating medical jargon. "I'd like to run some basic blood work," she said. "But based on my examination, Max appears to be in excellent health. His weight is perfect, his coat is shiny, his energy level seems normal. What symptoms were you originally concerned about?" I explained how the fake Dr. Hayes had diagnosed inflammatory bowel disease, along with the various complications that had supposedly developed over time. Dr. Chen frowned as she made notes. "Did Max ever show signs of digestive distress? Vomiting, diarrhea, loss of appetite, lethargy?" "No, never. He's always eaten normally, had regular bowel movements, maintained his energy level." She made more notes in Max's new file. "Let's wait for these test results, but I'm not seeing any indication of IBD or the other conditions you mentioned. His abdomen feels completely normal, no signs of inflammation or discomfort." While we waited for the blood work, Dr. Chen asked me detailed questions about the treatments Max had received. The expensive prescription food, the monthly blood draws, the supplements, the various medications. "Mrs. Walsh, some of what you're describing doesn't align with standard IBD treatment protocols. The frequency of blood work seems excessive for a dog with stable symptoms, and several of the medications you mentioned aren't typically used for inflammatory bowel disease." The blood work came back 2 hours later. Perfect. Every single marker was within normal range. Max was not just healthy. He was exceptionally healthy for a 3-year-old golden retriever. "Mrs. Walsh," Dr. Chen said carefully, "I need to ask you something. This previous veterinarian, did he show you actual test results or just tell you about them?" I thought back to all those appointments. The fake Dr. Hayes had always mentioned test results, described numbers and percentages, but I realized he'd never actually shown them to me. He'd referenced the findings verbally, but the paperwork I received just listed services, rendered, and charges. He never showed me the actual results. He would tell me about them, but I never saw the lab reports. Dr. Chen nodded grimly. "Combined with what you've told me about the credential discrepancies, I'd like to recommend that you report this to the State Veterinary Board immediately. What you're describing sounds like identity theft and veterinary fraud." She pulled out a business card and wrote a phone number on the back. "This is Inspector Martinez with the State Board. I'm going to call her myself after you leave, but you should contact her as well with your documentation." That evening, I sat at my kitchen table with a notepad, trying to remember every detail of every appointment. The expensive food that Max never seemed to need, the supplements that didn't change anything, the monthly blood draws that apparently never showed what the fake Dr. Hayes claimed they showed. I also realized something else that bothered me. In all those months of treatment, the fake Dr. Hayes had never recommended specialist consultation, never suggested referral to a veterinary internal medicine expert, never mentioned getting additional opinions on Max's supposedly complex case. Real veterinarians, especially newer ones, typically sought second opinions for difficult cases. My phone rang around 8 o'clock. The caller ID showed Hayes Animal Clinic. "Mrs. Walsh, this is Dr. Hayes. I wanted to follow up about Max's surgery. Have you made a decision?" His voice was smooth, concerned. The perfect bedside manner. It made my skin crawl knowing it was all an act. "Actually, I got a second opinion today." Silence on the other end. Then, carefully, "Oh? And what did they say?" "They said Max is perfectly healthy." Another pause, longer this time. "Well, Mrs. Walsh, I'd be happy to explain why another veterinarian might not catch the subtle signs that I've been monitoring. Sometimes a fresh pair of eyes can miss the underlying complexities of a case we've been managing long term." The gaslighting was so smooth, so practiced. How many other people had heard this exact speech? "Dr. Hayes, I'd like to see Max's actual test results. All of them. From the beginning. Of course, though, as I've mentioned, the technical details can be quite complex for someone without veterinary training to interpret properly. I'll manage. Also, I had some questions about your background. I tried to verify your graduation from Iowa State, and there seems to be some confusion." The silence stretched much longer this time. When he finally spoke, his voice was tighter, more controlled. "Mrs. Walsh, I'm not sure what kind of verification you think you need, but I can assure you my credentials are completely legitimate. If you're having concerns about Max's treatment, Perhaps we should schedule a consultation to address them properly. I think that would be helpful, I said. Tomorrow afternoon? Very well. 2 o'clock. But Mrs. Walsh, I do want to stress that delaying Max's surgery could have serious consequences. I'd hate to see his condition worsen while we're dealing with what I'm sure are just administrative misunderstandings. I hung up, my heart pounding. Tomorrow I'd confront him directly with what I'd discovered. But first, I needed to gather more evidence and make sure someone knew where I was going. I called Dr. Chen's office and asked if she could provide me with copies of Max's blood work results and her examination notes. I also contacted the Iowa State Veterinary Program again, this time asking for official documentation about the real Robert Hayes' graduation and current employment status. The pieces of my plan were falling into place, but I realized I couldn't do this alone. I called Claire back. I need your help, I said without preamble. I'm meeting with the fake Dr. Hayes tomorrow, and I want someone to know where I am. Claire's tone had changed completely since our previous conversation. Jen, I did some research after our call. You're right to be suspicious. I found the real Robert Hayes' LinkedIn profile, his employer's website, and several professional photos. He's definitely in Montana, and his photo doesn't match the description you gave me of your vet. The validation from my sister felt like a lifeline. Claire, I need you to be ready to call the police if I don't check in by 5 o'clock tomorrow. Don't you think you should just report this to the authorities now? This sounds dangerous. If this person is willing to steal someone's identity and defraud pet owners, who knows what else they might be capable of? I want to give him a chance to explain himself first. Maybe there's some innocent explanation I haven't considered. But even as I said it, I knew there was no innocent explanation for using another veterinarian's identity to run a medical practice. The next morning, I woke up with a knot in my stomach that had nothing to do with breakfast. Max seemed to sense my anxiety and stayed close to my side as I got ready for the confrontation. I printed out copies of the real Robert Hayes' graduation photo, LinkedIn profile, and current employment verification, along with Max's clean blood work from Dr. Chen. At exactly 2 o'clock, I walked into Hayes Animal Clinic with my folder of evidence. The receptionist, Ashley, looked nervous when she saw me. She was a young woman, probably in her early 20s, who'd always been friendly during my previous visits. Mrs. Walsh, Dr. Hayes is waiting for you in his office, she said, but her usual smile seemed forced. I followed her down the familiar hallway, my heart pounding with each step. The fake Dr. Hayes was sitting behind his desk, looking perfectly composed and professional, but I could see the tension in his shoulders, the way his hands were clasped too tightly in front of him. Jennifer, thank you for coming in. I understand you have some concerns about Max's treatment. I sat down and opened my folder, placing the real Robert Hayes' graduation photo on his desk. My concerns aren't about Max's treatment. They're about your identity. His face went pale as he stared at the photo. For a moment, the mask of professional competence slipped, and I saw something like panic flash across his features. I'm not sure what you think this proves, he said, but his voice lacked its usual confidence. It proves that the real Robert Hayes graduated from Iowa State in 2019 and has been working as a large animal veterinarian in Montana ever since. It proves that whoever you are, you're not him. I pulled out more documents. The employment verification from Big Sky Veterinary Services, the LinkedIn profile showing the real Hayes with cattle and horses, the professional photos that clearly showed a different person. The man I'd known as Dr. Hayes sat back in his chair, his hands trembling slightly. For a long moment, neither of us spoke. I could hear the clock on his wall ticking, the distant sound of dogs barking in the examination rooms. "Who are you?" I asked quietly. He looked at me with something like relief, as if he was tired of carrying the lie. "My name is David Morrison. I'm a veterinary technician. Was a veterinary technician. I worked for the real Dr. Hayes in Montana for 6 months after he graduated." "So you do have some medical training?" 2 years of veterinary technician school at Iowa Western Community College, and those 6 months working under Hayes at the ranch. Not enough to be a real veterinarian, but enough to fake it for a while. The admission hit me like a physical blow. This man had been treating Max and dozens of other animals with minimal training and a stolen identity. Why? I asked. Why would you do this? David Morrison looked around his office, at the diplomas that weren't his, at the life he'd built on lies. I always wanted to be a veterinarian, but I couldn't afford medical school. The debt would have been astronomical, and I didn't have family support. When I worked for Hayes, I saw how much money he was making, how respected he was in the community. When he mentioned he was happy in Montana and had no plans to practice elsewhere, I saw my opportunity. So you stole his identity and moved here. I borrowed his credentials, he said defensively. Hayes was settled in Montana with a long-term contract. He never planned to practice in Iowa. I thought I could make it work. I'd studied veterinary medicine for 2 years, worked hands-on with a real vet. I researched everything constantly, double-checked every diagnosis, every treatment. By diagnosing healthy animals with fake diseases, by charging people thousands of dollars for treatments their pets didn't need. David's shoulders sagged. It started legitimately. I really believed some of the early cases needed treatment. But the overhead on this place is enormous. Rent, equipment, staff, insurance. When cases were slow, when animals came in that were clearly healthy, I convinced myself that preventive care was better than waiting for problems to develop. I stared at this man who'd been masquerading as a veterinarian for over 2 years, systematically defrauding pet owners throughout Cedar Falls. How many animals have you treated with fake diagnoses? I never intentionally hurt any animals, he said quickly. The treatments were unnecessary, but they weren't harmful. I made sure of that. I researched every medication, every procedure. I only prescribed things that wouldn't cause damage. You made sure? With your 2 years of veterinary technician training and 6 months of experience? David didn't answer. We both knew that his limited medical knowledge could have easily led to serious harm, despite his claims of caution. I could have seriously hurt Max with those unnecessary medications. I could have caused stress, complications, or worse, with all those pointless blood draws and treatments. But I didn't, David said desperately. I was careful. I researched everything extensively. I had medical references, veterinary textbooks, online resources. I only prescribed treatments that had minimal risk. That's not the point. The point is that you had no right to make those medical decisions. You're not a veterinarian. You don't have the training, the education, or the license to practice medicine. I pulled out my phone. I'm calling the police. Wait, David said, his voice panicked. Please, just wait. I know what I did was wrong, but I can make this right. I can return the money, shut down the practice, refer all current patients to real veterinarians. You don't have to destroy my life over this. I absolutely do have to report this. You've been practicing veterinary medicine without a license for years. You've defrauded dozens of families. You've put animals at risk. This isn't something I can just let slide. Before I could dial, Ashley burst into the office, her face flushed and desperate. David, there are people here from the state veterinary board. They're asking questions about your credentials, and they want to examine patient records. David went white. That's impossible. How could they know? Dr. Chen from Riverside called them yesterday, Ashley said, looking at me with a mix of fear and gratitude. She reported suspicious activity after Mrs. Walsh's visit. They've been investigating since early this morning. The weight of inevitability settled over the room. David Morrison's fraud was finally catching up with him, not just through my confrontation, but through the proper channels that Dr. Chen had set in motion. Ashley, I said gently, were you part of this? Did you know about the fake identity? She shook her head vigorously. I had no idea about any of it. I thought David was just thorough with his diagnoses, maybe overly cautious. When I started noticing patterns, healthy animals getting expensive treatments, test results that never seemed to match what I observed, I asked questions, but he always had explanations. She looked at David with a mixture of betrayal and sadness. He said he'd make sure I never got another job in town if I caused problems. Said his family had connections throughout the county. My family does have connections, David said quietly, but not the kind that can help with federal crimes. Inspector Martinez appeared in the doorway with a police officer and another official I didn't recognize. Mr. Morrison, we need to speak with you immediately about your credentials and business practices. The inspector looked at me with recognition. Mrs. Walsh, Dr. Chen mentioned you might be here. Are you all right? I'm fine. Better than fine, actually. I finally have answers. Inspector Martinez turned her attention back to David. Mr. Morrison, you have the right to remain silent, but we'd appreciate your cooperation in this investigation. We have evidence of identity theft, practicing veterinary medicine without a license, and multiple counts of fraud. As the authorities led David Morrison away, he turned back to look at me one last time. The fake confidence was completely gone, replaced by the defeated expression of a man whose lies had finally caught up with him. I'm sorry, he said quietly. I really am sorry. I never meant for it to go this far. I watched him leave, feeling a complex mix of anger, relief, and something unexpected, pity. David Morrison wasn't evil in the traditional sense, just desperate and misguided. But his choices had put Max and dozens of other animals at risk, and that was unforgivable. Inspector Martinez stayed behind to get my statement. Mrs. Walsh, you should know that your decision to get a second opinion and ask questions probably saved a lot of animals from unnecessary procedures. Miss Morrison had been operating this fraud for about 2 years, but he was getting bolder and more reckless. We think he would have been caught soon anyway. 2 years. It seemed like both forever and no time at all. I thought about all the families who trusted him, all the pets who'd been subjected to fake treatments based on stolen credentials and minimal training. What happens now? Now we build a comprehensive case. Identity theft, practicing medicine without a license, fraud, potentially endangering animal welfare. Mr. Morrison is looking at serious criminal charges. We'll also be investigating every case he handled to determine restitution for his victims. Over the next few days, the scope of David Morrison's deception became clear. Inspector Martinez called me regularly with updates as they dug deeper into his fraudulent practice. Morrison had indeed worked as a veterinary technician for the real doctor, Hayes in Montana, but his employment had ended after Hayes discovered discrepancies in medication inventories. Morrison had been taking prescription drugs and veterinary supplies, claiming they were for personal pet care. Hayes had fired him but hadn't pressed charges, something he now regretted. Morrison had used his brief employment with Hayes to learn about veterinary practice management, billing procedures, and common diagnoses. He'd also observed Hayes's confident demeanor with clients and copied his professional mannerisms. The interesting thing, Inspector Martinez explained, is how limited Morrison's fraud actually was. He couldn't perform complex procedures or handle serious emergencies. His technical skills weren't advanced enough. So he focused almost exclusively on healthy animals that he could diagnose with chronic, manageable conditions requiring expensive but simple treatments. When Morrison arrived in Cedar Falls, he'd presented himself as the real Robert Hayes to landlords, suppliers, and licensing boards. He'd used forged documents and the real Hayes' credentials to establish his fraudulent practice. The elaborate nature of his deception explained how he'd maintained it for nearly 2 years, though investigators found he'd had several close calls. Morrison was actually quite clever about limiting his exposure, Inspector Martinez continued. He referred any genuinely sick animals to other veterinarians, claiming his schedule was full or that the cases required specialized care. This way, he avoided situations where his limited training would be exposed by actual medical emergencies. She showed me a chart they'd created of Morrison's patient patterns. Look at this! Almost every animal he treated long-term was perfectly healthy. He had an eye for identifying pet owners who were anxious about their animal's health, especially elderly people living alone or first-time pet owners who didn't know what normal behavior looked like. The most disturbing part, Inspector Martinez told me, is how systematically Morrison targeted specific types of clients. He kept detailed notes on which pet owners were most trusting, which ones asked the fewest questions, which ones had emotional attachments that made them vulnerable to manipulation. He specifically avoided experienced pet owners or people with veterinary backgrounds. The investigation revealed that Morrison had used a combination of his limited medical knowledge from technician training and carefully researched information to create believable treatment plans. He'd focused on common, chronic conditions that were difficult for pet owners to verify: digestive issues, food sensitivities, early-stage joint problems, conditions that required ongoing management rather than dramatic interventions. Morrison was smart enough to know his limitations, Inspector Martinez explained. He never attempted complex diagnostics or emergency procedures. When genuinely sick animals came in, he'd refer them elsewhere, claiming he was too busy or that they needed specialized care. This way, he avoided exposing his lack of real veterinary training. But his system had been breaking down in recent months. Morrison had become overconfident and started attempting more complex diagnoses. The near miss with the dog's actual heart condition had rattled him, and several clients had begun questioning his recommendations. I wasn't the only one who'd sought second opinions. Morrison was under increasing scrutiny when my complaint triggered the formal investigation. As I walked out of that clinic for the last time, I realized this was just the beginning of a long legal process. David Morrison had deceived dozens of families, but today marked the start of making sure he could never do it again. Max was waiting for me in Claire's car, and he bounded over to me the moment I stepped outside. I buried my face in his golden fur, breathing in his familiar scent of sunshine and grass. He was safe, healthy, and free from David Morrison's lies forever. Claire had driven up from Des Moines to support me through the confrontation. "How do you feel?" she asked as we drove home. "Angry, relieved, vindicated." I looked back at Max, who was contentedly watching the world pass by through the rear window, but mostly grateful that I trusted my instincts. "What made you finally question him?" I thought about that moment in Morrison's office when he'd proposed the expensive surgery for a clearly healthy dog. It was Max's tail wagging. Here's this supposedly sick animal, supposedly in need of emergency surgery, and he's wagging his tail and trying to play. Morrison was describing a medical crisis, but Max looked exactly like he always did, happy and healthy. Over the following weeks, I learned more about the extent of Morrison's fraud. Other pet owners began coming forward with similar stories. Mrs. Patterson, the elderly woman with Snowball the cat, had spent nearly $3,000 on fake kidney treatments. The Henderson family had paid for unnecessary hip dysplasia therapy for their perfectly healthy puppy. A retired couple had allowed Morrison to perform dental surgery on their dog based on fabricated X-rays. Each story followed the same pattern: healthy animals diagnosed with serious conditions, expensive treatment plans, gradual escalation of procedures, and owners who trusted their veterinarian's authority. Ashley, Morrison's former receptionist, proved to be crucial to the investigation. She'd kept detailed records of appointments, treatments, and client interactions that helped investigators understand the full scope of the fraud. She also revealed that Morrison had pressured her to mislead clients about test results and appointment scheduling. He would tell me to call people and say their pet's condition was worsening, even when the animals looked fine, Ashley told investigators. If I questioned him, he'd say I didn't have the medical training to understand what I was seeing. 3 months later, I stood in the packed Cedar Falls Community Center, watching David Morrison being led out in handcuffs. The state veterinary board hearing had concluded with criminal charges being filed, and the legal proceedings were moving forward rapidly. Inspector Martinez had been right about the scope of his fraud. The investigation revealed that Morrison had victimized about 30 families in 2 years, collecting approximately $100,000 in unnecessary treatments. His veterinary technician training had helped him avoid causing obvious physical harm, but several animals had suffered unnecessary stress from procedures they didn't need. What's remarkable, Inspector Martinez later told me, is how Morrison managed his limitations. He never attempted complex surgeries or emergency procedures. He always referred those cases elsewhere. He stuck to what he knew: basic blood draws, simple medications, dietary changes, and supplements. The fraud worked because the treatments were convincing but low risk. The investigation also revealed that Morrison had been making increasingly dangerous mistakes in his final months of operation. He'd misdiagnosed a dog with an actual heart condition, nearly missing a serious problem while focused on fabricating a digestive issue. Another case involved a cat with early-stage kidney disease that Morrison had dismissed as healthy because it didn't fit his pattern of treating only healthy animals. What satisfied me most wasn't seeing him arrested. It was watching the room full of pet owners who'd finally learned the truth about their healthy animals. Mrs. Patterson sat in the front row with Snowball purring in her lap. The cat Morrison claimed needed kidney surgery was thriving on a simple diet change recommended by Dr. Chen. Miss Patterson had gotten back every penny she'd paid for the fraudulent treatments, plus compensation for her emotional distress. The Henderson family was there with their golden retriever puppy, now 6 months older, and clearly free of the hip problems Morrison had fabricated. The Hendersons had become advocates for veterinary fraud awareness, speaking at community meetings about recognizing the warning signs of unnecessary treatments. Kevin and Rachel were there too, looking embarrassed but grateful. Duke the German Shepherd was bounding around their backyard, completely free of the heartworm that never existed. Kevin had actually apologized to me afterward, admitting he should have listened when I tried to warn them. "Ladies and gentlemen," the prosecutor announced, "this case represents a significant veterinary fraud scheme that exploited the trust between pet owners and medical professionals. Over approximately 2 years, the defendant used stolen credentials and limited veterinary knowledge to defraud about 30 families of nearly $100,000. Thanks to the courage of witnesses like Jennifer Walsh and Ashley Porter, no other families will fall victim to this man's deception." The prosecutor went on to explain Morrison's methodology in detail. The defendant was careful to stay within his limited abilities. He focused on healthy animals that he diagnosed with chronic, manageable conditions. He avoided emergency situations and complex procedures that would have exposed his inadequate training. This systematic approach allowed him to maintain his fraud longer than might otherwise have been possible. But the prosecutor also noted Morrison's increasing recklessness in recent months. Evidence shows that the defendant was becoming overconfident and making more serious diagnostic errors. He was beginning to attempt procedures beyond his skill level, putting animal welfare at greater risk. The investigation suggests that his scheme was already beginning to unravel due to his own mistakes. Ashley had quit her job at Hayes Animal Clinic the day after the investigation began and was now working at Dr. Chen's practice. She'd overcome her fear of Morrison's threats and testified at every hearing about the suspicious patterns she'd witnessed. Her detailed records and testimony were crucial to proving the systematic nature of Morrison's fraud. The sentencing hearing was scheduled for the following month, but Morrison's defense attorney was already discussing plea agreements. The evidence against him was overwhelming. Forged documents, stolen identity, fraudulent medical records, and testimony from dozens of victims. After the hearing, Claire and I drove to the park, where Max loved to play fetch. He was still the same healthy, energetic dog he'd always been, but now I had official documentation to prove it. Dr. Chen had run extensive tests and confirmed that none of Morrison's treatments had caused permanent damage. "I'm proud of you, Jen," Claire said as we watched Max chase other dogs around the pond. "You could have just switched veterinarians and moved on. Instead, you made sure he couldn't hurt anyone else." I scratched behind Max's ears as he returned with his tennis ball, dripping wet from the pond. I kept thinking about all those families who trusted him the way I did. How many Mrs. Pattersons were out there, spending their limited savings on treatments their pets didn't need? The Cedar Falls Gazette had run a comprehensive series about the case, and I'd received dozens of emails from people sharing their own experiences with veterinary fraud. It was apparently more common than anyone realized, especially in small towns where people didn't question medical authority. Dr. Chen had offered me a part-time job at her clinic, helping educate pet owners about recognizing signs of unnecessary treatments. It wasn't something I'd ever planned to do, but the work felt meaningful. Teaching people to ask questions, to trust their instincts, to get second opinions when something didn't feel right. Morrison's elaborate deception had unraveled completely once investigators started digging. His rental agreements, supplier contracts, and insurance policies were all based on fraudulent credentials. The clinic's landlord was evicting the practice, and Morrison faced civil lawsuits from multiple victims in addition to criminal charges. But my favorite part of the aftermath came 6 weeks later, when I received a letter from a woman in Missouri. She'd read about our case online and recognized similar patterns with her local veterinarian. Her investigation led to another fraud conviction and saved dozens more pets from unnecessary procedures. Mark started something bigger than we realized, I told him one evening as we walked through our neighborhood. He wagged his tail, completely unaware that his fake illness had exposed a criminal and protected countless other animals. The house felt different now, lighter somehow. The stress that had consumed me for months was gone, replaced by a sense of purpose I hadn't expected. Max seemed to sense it too. He was more relaxed, more playful, as if he could feel that the cloud of fake medical drama had finally lifted. I kept the folder of Morrison's fraudulent test results, not as evidence anymore, but as a reminder that trusting my instincts had been right. That standing up to someone in a position of authority, even when it felt scary and uncertain, had been worth it. Dr. Chen called it medical gaslighting when we talked about the psychological aspects of Morrison's fraud. He had used his perceived expertise and stolen credentials to make pet owners doubt their own observations about their healthy animals. The technical jargon, the condescending explanations, the urgent timelines, all designed to prevent people from asking questions. "You broke through that, doctor," Chen told me during one of Max's regular checkups. "You trusted what you could see with your own eyes over what someone was telling you to believe. That takes courage." On weekends, I started volunteering at the county animal shelter, helping match families with pets who genuinely needed homes. It was a different kind of animal care than the medical fraud I'd exposed, but it felt connected somehow. All about making sure animals got the care they actually needed, not the care someone wanted to profit from. Max loved coming with me to the shelter. He had a gentle way with nervous rescue dogs, showing them that humans could be trusted. The shelter director said he was a natural therapy dog, helping other animals heal from real trauma while he enjoyed perfect health. The legal proceedings stretched on for months. Morrison's defense team tried various strategies, claiming he genuinely believed he was providing necessary care, arguing that his technician training qualified him for basic veterinary procedures, suggesting that the pet owners had given informed consent for treatments. None of it worked. The evidence was too clear, the pattern of deception too systematic. Morrison had knowingly used another person's identity to practice medicine without proper qualifications. He had fabricated diagnoses and manipulated vulnerable pet owners for financial gain. One Saturday afternoon, I was walking Max through downtown when we passed the empty building that used to house Hayes Animal Clinic. The windows were covered with brown paper, and there was a for-lease sign in the door. Max didn't even glance at it, but I stopped for a moment, remembering how afraid I'd been to confront Morrison with my suspicions. The fear seemed almost silly now. Morrison had been nothing more than a con artist with minimal training, preying on people's love for their pets. His authority had been entirely false, built on stolen credentials and desperate ambition rather than genuine expertise. A year later, Dr. Chen opened a second location in the building where Morrison's clinic used to be. She asked me to help design the waiting room, making it warm and welcoming rather than clinical and intimidating. We put up photos of healthy pets from the community, including several pictures of Max playing in the park. "We want people to feel comfortable asking questions here," Dr. Chen explained to her staff during their first meeting in the new location. "No medical jargon unless we explain it in plain English. No rushed decisions on expensive procedures. No making people feel stupid for wanting second opinions." Max was officially our clinic ambassador, greeting nervous pets and their owners with his calm, friendly presence. He wore a special bandana that said, "Ask questions," in bright blue letters. Children especially loved him, and he seemed to understand that his job was to make the veterinary experience less scary. The criminal trial concluded, with Morrison receiving a 3-year prison sentence and an order to pay full restitution to his victims. The judge noted that his crimes were particularly serious because they exploited people's trust in medical professionals and put vulnerable animals at risk. "Mr. Morrison," the judge said during sentencing, "you violated the most basic principles of medical ethics. Pet owners trusted you with their beloved animals' lives, and you exploited that trust for personal gain. Your minimal training does not excuse the systematic nature of your deception." Morrison's veterinary technician license was permanently revoked, and he was banned from working in any animal-related field. The real Dr. Hayes in Montana had to deal with professional complications from the identity theft, but the veterinary board cleared him of any wrongdoing and helped restore his reputation. I didn't attend the sentencing. I'd said everything I needed to say during the investigation phase. The day Morrison was sentenced, Max and I were at the park, playing fetch with a group of dogs whose owners had become friends through our shared experience as Morrison's victims. Mrs. Patterson brought Snowball in a carrier, and even the elderly cat seemed to enjoy watching the dogs play. "I can't believe I almost let him operate on her," Mrs. Patterson said, scratching Snowball's chin. "She's the healthiest cat the real vet has ever seen." That evening, as I filled Max's food bowl with regular, affordable dog food instead of Morrison's expensive prescription formula, I realized something important had changed in me. I wasn't just Max's owner anymore. I was his advocate, his protector, someone who would never again let another person convince me that my healthy dog was sick. Max seemed to understand the difference. He ate his dinner with enthusiasm, played with his favorite toys, and curled up beside me on the couch with the contentment of a dog who knew he was truly safe. The veterinary fraud case had taught me valuable lessons about questioning authority, trusting instincts, and standing up for what's right. It had also connected me with a community of pet owners who'd learned the same lessons through their own experiences with Morrison's deception. We formed an informal support group that met monthly, sharing information about veterinary care, discussing red flags to watch for, and supporting each other through the ongoing legal proceedings. Several members became advocates for veterinary fraud awareness, speaking at community events and sharing their stories with other pet owners. The case also led to changes in Iowa's veterinary licensing procedures. The state board implemented new verification processes for credentials and established a hotline for reporting suspicious veterinary practices. Other states adopted similar measures, creating a network of safeguards against fraudulent practitioners. The last piece of my revenge wasn't dramatic or public. It was simply this: living a happy, healthy life with my dog, free from fear and deception. Morrison was in prison, his lies exposed, his victims compensated. But Max and I were home, together, exactly where we belonged. As I turned off the lights that night, Max already asleep at the foot of my bed, I felt the deep satisfaction that comes from protecting something you love. Not just Max, but all the other pets whose owners would never have to wonder if their healthy animals were really sick. Morrison had tried to steal our peace of mind, our trust, our money. Instead, he'd given me something I never expected, the knowledge that I was stronger than I'd realized, and the purpose that came from using that strength to protect others. Max stretched in his sleep, his paws twitching as he chased dream tennis balls through endless green fields. He was healthy, happy, and free, exactly what every pet deserved to be.